Welcome to Reason Workshop Class 12. We're going to go over the Subtractor. We'll go through a Subtractor overview. Then we'll go through the analog oscillators and oscillation types. Then the filter section. Then we'll go through the play parameters. Then the LFOs. Then envelopes. Then the velocity controls. Then CV and audio connections. And finally a test. So the Subtractor is a polyphonic synthesizer that's waveform based. So you have sine waves, square waves, and all those basic waveform types that standard analog synthesizers have been using for years. So first thing I'll show you is where to browse patch. This is where you browse patch or save patch. Over here you have the play parameters of legato, retrigger, then portamento, polyphony, and then we have a bunch of different expressions of aftertouch or assigning expression pedals or breath controllers to control different parameters. Over here you have pitch and mod wheels and parameters, two different oscillators with different parameters, then noise controls. Then you have two different LFOs, LFO1 and LFO2. Then we have a mod envelope, two different filter sections. We also have a filter envelope. This is your master volume level. Over here is amp envelope, and then finally we have velocity controls. On the back of it, we have CV controls ends for sequencer control. Then we have modulation control, modulation output, gate input, and then this is your main audio out. So we'll start out and go over the oscillators. So first I'll initialize the patch, which starts completely from scratch. So only one oscillator is on. An oscillator makes a wave sound, so it's a standard pitch. So the first one is a sawtooth waveform. This is the first parameter that it brings up. Next is a square waveform. You hit the up button, you'll hear this is what a square wave sounds like. Next is a triangle waveform. And then after that we have a sine wave. Those are the main four types. After that we get into a bunch of numbers of different waveforms that are variations on those initial four. There are a whole bunch of other ones. You can just continue browsing through those. A bit of a preview of all the sounds that are capable within each oscillator. And you can turn on two of them, two oscillator sections, and you can blend them together in a whole bunch of different ways. So let's select this one, 6 on oscillator 2, and then we'll select the mix between the two of them. And we can also go up and down in octaves. So we'll select oscillator 1 on octave 2, and I can also turn off the keyboard track. No matter where I'm playing on the keyboard, it's playing that same note. In this case, I'll use the pitch bend wheel to play all over the keyboard. So now let's go over the phase offset. So that basically makes a copy of the signal. So it makes a copy of the signal similar to like a chorus. And depending on how much you offset that signal with it is dictated by that phase knob. So in terms of the offset, there is both multiplication, subtraction, and offset off. There's also FM, frequency modulation. That's the frequency of one oscillator called the carrier, which is modulated by the frequency of the other oscillator called the modulator. And ring mod is a similar kind of thing, but it deals with multiplication of those signals together. Then you can turn on noise to give a little bit of grit onto the sound. So you can hear that it's kind of like the dirt on the attack of the signal. Just on the beginning, you can change that on the decay so that the noise disappears as the note's carried out. You can change the brightness and the darkness and the level. Now let's go over the filter section. So the main two faders are the frequency and the resonance. The resonance tells you how much signal is going through that filter. With the resonance down, it's more subtle. If you turn the resonance all the way up, you'll hear it really intense. So there's a few different filter types. The first one we're going to go over that you're hearing now is a 24 dB low pass. So you can hear it's a very drastic movement every time this fader goes up and down. The next one is a 12 dB low pass filter. So you'll hear it's not quite as sharp of a movement as this fader goes up and down. So you can hear that 24 is really drastic, 12, the movement is more subtle. Next is the band pass, which is a very narrow boost. Next is a high band pass. So this just cuts out the low frequencies, which is really usable for great bass sounds, because every time that you bring this down, you'll hear the bass is brought out. Now for a notch filter, it just cuts out some of the middle, so it does cuts instead of boosts. For keyboard control, depending on where you're playing on the keyboard. So I'll turn off keyboard track on the oscillators, and you can see here that as I move up the keyboard, the filter's opening more. Now there also are two filters which you can actually link. So I'll demonstrate that a little bit. Turn them on band pass. You can hear it. Then you can turn them off. You can either link them. So you have two different filters that are happening to open in different places. Okay, now let's go over the play parameters. Starting out with polyphony. So that deals with how many notes you can play at one time. So I can play a chord. So if I turn polyphony on 2 notes, but I play 3 notes, it's only going to allow 2 of those notes to come in. But now let's put it on 1, and that turns it into a mono synth. A lot of early synths just had a ribbon underneath all the keys. So you could only play 1 note at a time, and there was a certain kind of bump to the way that those keyboards would play. So let's go over mode now. Legato on retrigger. So you can hear there's a clear attack when I have it on retrigger, but if I put it on legato, it's almost like a hammer-on or a gliss between the notes. So if I stop and play 1 note at a time, it's going to have a strong attack. But if I hold it down while I'm playing, then it's going to have a gliss between the notes. Okay, really interesting legato effect. Let's move now to portamento, another really cool effect. It's a glide between the notes. So if I attack them separately, it's not going to do anything, but if I hold them down, you can hear it slides between the notes. So I can do these drastic effects by holding down 1 note low on the keyboard, then a higher note. And you'll hear this really high slide. Keep low bandwidth off. You want it to be the highest fidelity. Let's check out the play controls. So right now we'll go over after touch. I'll have that affect the filter. So after I press the key down, the filter opens up. Then you can also assign that to an expression pedal or a breath control. If you have like a Yamaha breath controller, as you blow into it, you can affect different parameters. Let's go over the LFO now. So LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. It's basically a waveform that you can use to modulate any different section of the synth. The amount knob is really important. You want to turn that up to enable the low frequency oscillator. And you can select the destination as well as the different kind of waveform. Whether it just be an up ramp or a down ramp. And then you have the rate here. And here's a square waveform. And next is random. The next two are random. Now it sounds pretty weird because we're actually oscillating the pitch. You can get some other musical examples by controlling the filter frequency. Or to FM. Or to phase. And this sync enable is important because that syncs the tempo to the tempo of your song. Let's go over LFO2 now. There are just a few extra parameters. One thing that you have is keyboard track. The lower that you play on the keyboard, the slower the LFO goes. Also, you can turn it on amp, which is a feature that's only in LFO2, that is like a tremolo effect to automate the volume. Now let's go over envelopes and discuss how envelopes work. First, when you hit a note, there's the attack, how long it takes from the initial strike to get to its full volume. After that, you have the decay. Once it reaches the peak, how long it takes to get to its resting place. Then you have the sustain, which is the resting place, and then you finally have the release time. So once you take your finger off, how loud that volume is. So let's actually go through the amp envelope. Here's the release, but if I turn it up, even though my finger's not pressing down anymore, it still is carried out, kind of like a sustain pedal for the piano. Next you have the sustain, which is a resting place. And then you have the decay right after the initial attack. And then we have the attack. So the higher you turn it up, the longer it takes to get to its full volume. You can get some kind of like bowed string effect with it. Now let's go over the filter envelopes. Okay, so those same envelope parameters can apply to the filter to make it kind of open and close. The attack is really interesting in this. At higher settings, you can hear the filter sweep change directions. Now let's go over the mod envelope. You can have the envelope applied to a bunch of different parameters. Some of these parameters are really effective using the modulation wheel on your keyboard for real-time control. Now let's go over velocity control. So velocity has to do with how hard you're playing the keyboard. So starting out with it applied to amp, so that you have more expression with your keyboard control. Now let's go over the back connections. Through some CV connections, I'm going to connect a redrum to the amp envelope and then program a basic drum beat in the redrum. Now as I hold down notes on the Subtractor, all the attacks are happening with that redrum. Now I can also plug that into the filter so that that bass drum pattern that's on redrum channel 1 is controlling when the filter opens and closes in a rhythm.